Hello, welcome to the Grand Prix podcast.
Hey!
Behind the glamour and the glory of Formula One lies a past shaped by danger, heartbreak and loss. Since the championship began in 1950, the sport has witnessed moments of sheer brilliance, but also unimaginable tragedy. For decades, drivers raced on the edge, knowing that the crash might not just end their career, it could end their life. The early days of F1 were brutal, fatalities were common, and safety was often an afterthought. But from the ashes of tragedy, slowly came change, driven by relentless campaigners, pioneering engineers, and brave drivers who demanded more. In today's episode, we'll be taking a serious look at the evolution of safety in Formula One, from the darkest days of the sport to the innovations that saved lives and reshaped racing. This is a story of reform born from risk, a journey through fire to build a future where speed doesn't have to cost everything.
Very nice intro.
Thank you very much. I have to mention that this has been a huge undertaking and a lot to research, and whilst I've worked very hard, there may be things that I have missed. This is a broader look at how safety's evolved, not a year-on-year look at how sports' ever-changing regulations continue to move on. So if there are things that are missed, just accept it.
Oh. Good to know.
I love that we have a disclaimer.
We do have a disclaimer. Listen, I've enjoyed researching this, but I have been looking into 75 years of the sport.
Yeah.
So we're going through a lot of interesting stuff, but it is going to be a broader look at how safety evolved, not a year-by-year thing, because there will be things that will be hopped and skipped over in the interest of just not making this an ever-changing weekly episode in which we go through 75 episodes each year. I can't do that.
Yep, that's fair.
We have races to watch.
So, I guess, where do we start with safety? Probably the beginning. Let's go to the start. So, F1 began in 1950, but there was racing before that. Before we had the FIA governing F1, there was the Association Internationale des Automobiles Clubs Reconnus.
Very smooth accent.
Or the AIACR, which was the governing body from 1930 to 1939 and hosted the European Championship, which was the World Championship in every way apart from by name. However, due to the outbreak of World War II, the championship ended in 1939. But in 1946, the Commission Sportive Internationale, or CSI, not Crime Scene Investigation, anyone who thinks that, I definitely didn't think that when I first heard CSI, which was the sporting arm of the AIACR, started to take steps to rebuild motorsporting after the war. It replaced the 80-year-old president with Augustin Pérouse, who started discussions on a new Grand Prix formula. At the same time, the rather long AIACR title was scrapped, thank God, by the easier-to-remember Fédération Internationale de l'Automobile, or the FIA as we have it today. Apparently, as legend would have it, no one is actually sure who had the first idea of an official Formula One World Championship, but the credit was widely given to Marquis Antonio Briviesforza. In 1949, it was confirmed that the FIA Formula One World Championship would start in 1950, with a world champion elected at the end of the season. The first race would be Silverstone in the UK, a track we still have on the F1 calendar today. The circuit would be lined with hay bales, and a lot of the tracks on the calendar were repurposed from old airfields after the war.
Interesting.
It's something they had an abundance of and apparently not much use anymore for.
Yeah,
so
fair.
Makes sense.
Pretty much.
So now that you've had your little history lesson on where F1 began, let's go into where safety in F1 began. So once the first F1 championship started, it's fair to say that safety wasn't at the forefront of the sport as it is today. Back in 1950, the cars were built purely for speed, and the attire for racing drivers was more of a wear whatever you like kind of situation. When Juan Manuel Fangio roared to success, winning 5 championships between 1951 and 1957, his preferred racewear was polo shirts, work jackets, and slacks. And this wasn't uncommon.
It's a bit ugly.
Oh.
You can't call him out for looking ugly.
Have you seen what you're wearing?
Hey.
Grand Prix also operates on a wear whatever you like situation. We don't call you
Sorry,
out
you're
for
a
it.
joggers.
It's my day off work. Calm down. Back then, the drivers would wear a cloth skull cap, cotton overalls, sometimes even short-sleeved t-shirts, leather boots and leather gloves, and a trusty pair of goggles, which was only really protecting them from dirt and insects while they drove around during races. The cars were front-engined, rear-wheeled and had narrow tyres so drivers could power slide through corners, and there were no seatbelts. As the cars were so highly combustible, it was thought that it was better for a driver to be thrown from a car instead of trapped in the car while it was on fire. It would be a few years before designers found that putting the engines behind the drivers would allow them to put more power down easily and make them less likely to spin. Now, marshals have played a critical role in F1 safety since the 1950s, and obviously we still have marshals today, and they are often the first to arrive at a scene after a crash, where the primary responsibility is to manage the situation and help drivers. These individuals are trained volunteers who handle trackside operations and emergency response. It wouldn't be until 1952 that drivers were mandated to wear cork helmets. The helmets were made from cloth-covered cork and then modelled to shape the driver's head, and they were soaked in glue and dried for strengthening. But the helmets only covered the skull. The face and the ears weren't protected at all, and over time, leather flaps were developed to cover the ears.
That's safe.
Yeah.
Leather flaps. That's what we needed.
I'm picturing like a little beagle or something with like flappy ears.
Pretty much, yeah. Like the old aviation pictures where people have got the flaps over with the big goggles.
Yes.
That was pretty much what they were doing.
Now, fatalities were a common occurrence, and 5-time Grand Prix F1 world champion Juan Manuel Fangio wrote in his autobiography that over his 10-year career, 30 of his fellow competitors were killed in motor racing
30?
accidents. Yeah. That's an insane stat.
Yeah, it is.
Racing drivers at the time were expected to take on these potentially life-ending risks.
Looking at the timeline of the fact that they did racing before the war and then they came back to racing after the war and sort of formalised it into a championship, I think that you have to remember that by the time that F1 started, World War II had only just finished 5 years prior. So you have to wonder if maybe the World War II happening may have affected the drivers' attitudes towards death. I think a lot of them, it was widely accepted that if you were going to be racing in motorsport, that there was a risk you'd lose your life, or other people that you were racing around might lose their lives. It wasn't really a sustained problem. Oh, we can't be hurt or killed in a crash. I wonder if that was the post-war sort of attitudes towards it. And a lot of these drivers had most likely served in the military and maybe just a bit more hardened to war. And so as a result, safety and people dying in crashes wasn't seen as a big deal.
Yeah,
that
I
makes
guess
sense.
they were probably desensitized to death a bit.
Yeah, 100%. So I think that the early times of F1, they've 2 years in, they only just get helmets. They don't have any seatbelts. They don't have any medical care. They don't have a hospital nearby. They don't have any sort of restrictions to stop them getting hurt. And the cars are purely made for speed. Whereas as we see throughout the decades, they start to incorporate being safe for drivers. But I think that part of that is the time of which it was made.
I mean, I know currently drivers get paid a lot, right, for being in F1. They get a lot of money. I don't know if in the 1950s when it started that they did also get paid a lot of money, but do you think that could be part of it as well? Because post-war, a lot of people were in poverty as well and did need that money.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the drivers, were a lot older in the grid. I think some of the youngest ones were in their 30s, so they were a lot older. But a lot of them, they had their own vocations completely separate to Formula One. It wasn't seen as like
A full-time job.
Yeah, it was something that they came and competed in, but they had a wide variety of different vocations. So I don't even know if they were earning much money from it at the time. I think it was more of a post-war sort of excitement, and people were in austerity. So having this sort of formalised, exciting thing to look forward to and to enjoy, I think it was probably more of a distraction than it was something that it was still the pinnacle of the motorsport, but it wasn't seen as something that you would compete in all the time, especially at the first few races in 1950. There was lots of very random different vocations people had.
Makes sense.
And as well, I think if you look at it from like an entertainment perspective as well, the general public would have also been rather desensitized to death and stuff like that, and it might have just been seen as like a more entertaining, more thrilling thing if someone was to get seriously injured.
Yeah, 100%.
So, back to safety. By 1955, the first drum brakes that were used on F1 cars since the inception of the championship were replaced by disc brakes. Drum brakes would overheat quickly and cause brake fade, which is a loss of braking power due to overheating, whereas disc brakes dissipated heat much faster and offered more consistent and powerful braking, which was crucial to handling at high speeds. The Constructors' Championship didn't come along until 1958, and it's had many scoring systems since then, but the current iteration, used since 1991, is the most straightforward. Until then, it had only been a drivers' championship.
So by the 1960s, the F1 cars on the grid had flattened and were a shape that we were looking a little bit more familiar with. This era of cars were very elegant in style, but very dangerous as drivers sat around oil and fuel tanks. But this era of Formula One was a dark time for the sport, so much so that on average a driver was killed 1 out of every 8 races. So if F1 hadn't improved safety over the years, that would mean that during the current 2025 season that we're watching, 3 drivers would die in accidents across that 24 race calendar.
Oh God.
I just don't think that would be allowed on TV.
No. But back in those days, that's what I'm saying. The whole look around safety was completely different in F1 back in these days. The late 60s saw the introduction of advertising in Formula One cars, and sponsorship liveries soon replaced the previously used national colours. The advancement of F1 technology exploded as large companies recognised the value of sponsoring cars and begun to pour money into the sport. F1 cars soon transformed from the conventional front-style engines to sleek, aerodynamic, mid-engine race cars which looked more like a low-flying racecraft than road cars. And in 1961, the GDPA formed. Several drivers met in Monte Carlo to form the Grand Prix Drivers Association, or GDPA, with the intention of being a collective voice to the drivers to voice concerns over the safety of the sport to the CSI and FIA. Sir Sterling Moss was elected chairman, with Joe Bonnier elected as vice chairman.
And who is the representative this year?
Karen.
We've been over this. We've spoken about the GDPA before.
Yeah.
Which
is it Karen?
Because one of the drivers on the grid is a bit of a Karen.
Oh, George Russell.
There we go.
Yeah. I thought you meant like one of the women we talked about. I'm like, which one has been a Karen?
No, I'm saying the one driver that Nav called a Karen. During the 1960s, the sport had seen a string of accidents and, tragically, fatalities during races. These tragedies involved rollover accidents or incidents where drivers were thrown from the car or exposed during crashes. So in 1961, the rollover bar was introduced. A roll bar, or roll hoop, is a rigid structure, typically positioned just behind the driver's head, and is designed to prevent the driver's head from hitting the ground if the car flips, maintain a survivable space during a rollover or upside-down landing, and distribute crash forces to reduce deformation of the cockpit area. From my understanding, there was no particular crash or accident that triggered this safety measure, but rather a string of tragic deaths that highlighted the need for more safety measures to help protect the drivers and prevent them from losing their lives. So, Cameron Earl was an engineer killed during testing in 1952. Onofre Marion lost control during practice and crashed into a ravine and died from head and internal injuries. Bill Vukovich was killed in a fiery crash where his car flipped and caught fire in 1955 Indianapolis 500, which counted in the F1 World Championship at that time. Alberto Ascari was a 2-time world champion and crashed at high speed. His car flipped and he was thrown out. Luigi Mussolini, Peter Collins and Stuart Lewis Evans all died in races in 1958. And then came the 1955 Le Mans disaster. The 24-hour race at Le Mans is prestigious and still attracts fans around the world today. But in 1955, there was a tragic event that sent shockwaves throughout all of motorsport and served as a sobering reality check for drivers and officials in the sport of the important need for safety measures to be put in place. The 1955 Le Mans disaster was the worst accident in motor racing history at that point, occurring during the 24-hour race of Le Mans on June 11th. On the third hour of the race, Jaguar driver Mike Hawthorne braked hard to enter the pits, causing Lance Macklin to swerve into the path of Pierre Levay's Mercedes-Benz, which was travelling at over 125 miles per hour. Levay's car was launched into the air, disintegrated upon impact with a barrier, and its flaming debris, including the engine and hood, was hurled into a packed grandstand, killing Levay and 83 spectators and injuring over 180 others. The car's magnesium alloy body ignited in a deadly fire, and safety measures at the time were minimal, with spectators standing just feet from the track. Despite the scale of the tragedy, the race actually continued on to avoid panic and allow emergency access. Mercedes-Benz ended up withdrawing from the race and motorsport entirely for decades. The disaster triggered widespread safety reforms across motorsport, leading to improved circuit design, crowd protection, and car construction.
It's crazy that they continued.
I know. But they did it to try and minimise the amount of panic. But, that many people being hurt, the best thing you can do is to just pause everything.
Yeah.
Like, it's the most important thing is to make sure people are safe. But the attitude is very different from how it is now.
Yeah, I mean, it's not even just ensuring that people are safe. Like, pay some respect to the people that have just lost their lives.
Yeah, very true. But again, the drivers were expected, you carry on racing, and it's like, okay, fine, we'll carry on racing.
Yeah.
The whole way of that mentality is, again, very different to how we are now. So it's just such a large amount of people got hurt. It's just bonkers.
Well, I mean, currently you have, someone's car engine dies. Doesn't even necessarily have to be a crash. And you still get, a safety car.
Yeah.
And you have, a bit of a pause where everyone slows down, and then you continue. So
they won't even send drivers on track on wet tyres if it's raining too heavily.
Yeah.
But back then it was just like, oh, this huge accident has happened. Just keep going.
Yeah. It must have been very scary to have been there. Yeah. And as you say, for it to continue on with all of that chaos and people losing their lives and being injured, it just sounds unimaginable today.
Yeah.
By today's standards.
Scary and reputationally damaging enough for Mercedes to withdraw from the race and motorsport for ages as well.
Exactly. In 1963, there was a wave of safety measures put in place in the sport. Safety standards were relatively basic, but rising speeds and increasing accident fatalities forced reforms to be put in place. So here are some of them. Flag signals were introduced that were waved by marshals across the track at designated marshal points.
Ooh, quickfire quiz on flags.
Okay, sure.
Reem, what's a red flag?
Stop.
Yellow flag?
Slow down.
Blue flags?
Lapped cars.
Damn.
Oh my god.
Checkered flag?
Is it a warning?
Oh my god.
Black and white flag, to be fair. She's got it the wrong way.
Fair enough. I meant the one they wave at the end.
Oh, they finished the race.
There you go.
Oh my god, why am I proud? Why does she know her flags?
Oh, I'm learning.
Vehicle fire prevention was advanced by improvements in fuel tank construction. Fuel tanks were now required to be better constructed to prevent leaks and reduce fire risk. Double brake circuit becomes mandatory. All cars now needed dual brake circuits, meaning 2 independent hydraulic systems. It meant if one circuit failed, the other could still provide some braking power, which improved safety during mechanical failures. The FIA officially assumed the oversight of safety standards at all racing circuits, and drivers were required to wear fireproof suits. The Nomex heat shield fire suit arrived in motorsport after NASCAR's Bill Simpson was introduced to the material by NASA astronaut Pete Conrad. I thought that was quite cool.
That is quite cool.
Cockpits are now reconstructed to allow the drivers to be able to get out more quickly. And now we move on to one of a very legendary figure in Formula One, which is Sir Jackie Stewart. Both as a 3-time world champion driver and a pioneering safety advocate in motorsport, Jackie raced in F1 during the late 1960s and early 70s. He won 3 world championships in 1969, 71 and 73, and is considered one of the most talented and intelligent drivers of his era. But in the 1966 Belgian Grand Prix, Jackie had a brush with death that sent him on a one-man crusade to help improve safety in Formula One. On the first lap, a sudden rain shower that sent half the field spinning off the track left Stewart trapped in a ditch in his crumpled BRM car, with fuel leaking all around him. There was no track marshals nearby, so 2 drivers who had also crashed prized him out of the wreckage, and Stewart was stuffed into a decrepit old ambulance that got lost on the way to the hospital.
Oh.
As it turned out, I only had a broken collarbone, Stewart recalls, but it was simply ridiculous. Here was a sport that had serious injury and death so closely associated with it, yet there was no infrastructure to support it, and very few safety measures to prevent it. So, I felt I had to do something.
And do something he did. As the 60s melted into the 70s, many of those post-war drivers who possessed a willingness to just accept the dangers of the sport and race hard were either retired or had died. And in came a new generation of drivers. So Jackie Stewart couldn't ignore things like the lack of barriers or safety personnel. While his campaign was not popular, it did incite change in the sport. In 1969, Jackie Stewart led a driver boycott of the Belgian Grand Prix at Spa, as promoters would not pay for crucial safety upgrades that he demanded. The F1 car designers quickly realised in the 70s that the aerodynamic principles that applied to planes could also transfer into cars. This saw a lot of technical advancement in the sport, which meant that cars got faster and the need for safety was greater. Jackie Stewart had joined Tyrrell in 1968, and in his 6 seasons with Tyrrell, Stewart was nearly always the driver to beat and remained so until he retired at the end of 1973 at the age of 34. But in 1970, Stewart was devastated by the deaths of his close friends Piers Courage and Jochen Rindt. In 1973, his Tyrrell teammate Francois Sever was killed in what was to have been Stewart's last race, but the team withdrew out of respect. In 1970, fans would now have to be at least 3 metres away from the track, as well as between the track and the pit lane. A separation wall was newly mandatory. In 1971, in case of a fire, drivers had to test that they could leave the cockpit within 5 seconds. In 1972, 2 years after Jochen Rindt's crash in Monza, the 6-point safety harness was made mandatory to stop drivers being thrown out of their cars during crashes.
It seems really bonkers when you read it as a flat thing that 22 years into F1 racing that they only just got seatbelts in 1972 when you think about it.
Yeah, and the fireproof racing suits
Yeah.
and the separation barrier, like it seems like it's very much on a delay.
Yeah, very
hugely.
much.
I think they were very much behind where they should have been in terms of safety.
Yeah.
Although with the 6-point harness, although it makes sense, I get with the earliest iteration of cars that it did sound like if you weren't thrown from it, you would have just been part of that fire when you would have lost your life. But it still seems crazy that only 72 is when they finally had safety belts.
And I wonder if there's like, is there even a comparison at that during that decade of other sports that were dangerous, or was it just that they didn't know what to do with this one?
I don't know if it's comparable. I think that across, because obviously it wasn't just Formula One that had this lack of safety, it was across all levels of motorsport that all had it. And I think by having lots of different other categories of motorsport that were all operating in the same way, it's kind of ignorance is bliss. If the standard is low on safety across all of it, then it all stays that way.
Yeah. Now, the safety car made its first appearance in 1973's Canadian Grand Prix.
We love a safety car.
We do love a safety car. As a result of several safety incidents that were caused by harsh weather conditions. To control the chaos, a slick Porsche 914 was deployed out onto track, driven by a former Canadian racing driver. However, things did not run too smoothly as the safety car picked up the wrong lead driver, causing most of the field to end up a lap down. And this meant that it took several hours to figure out who actually won the race before Peter Revson was later confirmed the winner.
Can you imagine going home still not clear if you won that race or not?
Yeah.
Congratulations.
Question mark.
Now, in 1975, the FIA introduced standards for fire retardant suits, but in 1976, Niki Lauda's crash would prove that the cotton material was far too flammable. Now, Reem, you actually know about Niki Lauda, don't you?
I do, because I've seen the movie.
What is
movie?
it called?
I have no idea. Swoosh.
It's the ride at Thorpe Park that you don't like, the big swing.
I can't talk. I'm in a massive.
Oh, Rush.
There we go.
Rush. Yeah. That was a good movie.
With Chris Hemsworth.
Yes.
Yeah.
He was the hunk.
I don't know. Nope, don't know who played Niki Lauda. Sorry, not sure.
He's a brilliant actor, though. He's also in the other film.
The
one with the chef. The one with the chef in the kitchen. Bradley Cooper. Is
Burnt?
it? Burnt?
Oh, we're not going on any facts. Right? We go off script for 2 seconds and we're like, who played him?
So if you aren't aware of who Niki Lauda is, like Reem is aware, the legacy he has built in F1 or why he is so much loved around the world, this is a short anecdote that will give you a brilliant insight into who he was. So Ferrari's son Piero and Enzo Ferrari were at Niki Lauda's first Ferrari test in 1974. Piero was there to interpret for Niki as he did not speak Italian. Enzo said to his son, "Ask him how the car is," and Niki replied saying, "It's shit. It's understeered like hell. It doesn't work." Piero said, "You can't say the car is shit." Nicky asked, "Why? It is shit." Then Enzo said, "What did he say? A Ferrari is no good?" "Yes, it's shit," Nicky replied to Enzo directly. Nothing happened for 30 seconds. Then Enzo asked, "What is shit?" "It understeers. Front end is wrong. It doesn't turn in." So Enzo said, "If the engineer fixes the car, how much quicker can you go?" Nicky said, 3/10, maybe 5. So Enzo says, "If you don't go 5/10 quicker, you're fired." 5 days later, Nicky went 8/10 quicker. Ferrari was happy, and Nicky said that this was the first time that Enzo Ferrari respected him.
The "it's shit" is giving Lewis in 2025.
Well, they were close. So
He learned from the best.
I just think it's such a funny thing because when Lewis or any other driver in Ferrari is complaining about the car, they're not complaining about it to Enzo Ferrari themselves, like, because Enzo Ferrari is no longer with us. But Niki Lauda was giving that direct feedback to the guy that has named the car after his last name. Mm-hmm. I just think it's so badass to double down and say it's shit. It's so funny.
So the media noted Lauda's cool, calculating, clinical approach and nicknamed him the computer. Niki Lauda stormed to victory with Ferrari and became world champion in 1975. Fast forward to midsummer 1976, and Niki had won 5 races and seemed a shoo-in to repeat as champion. Then came the German Grand Prix at the desperately dangerous Nürburgring. On the second lap, Lauda's Ferrari crashed and burst into flames. 4 brave drivers and a marshal plunged into the towering flames and hauled Niki out. Niki was wearing a fire-resistant balaclava, but his helmet, that he'd modified and was ill-fitting, came off during the crash. In hospital, with 1st to 3rd degree burns on his head and wrists, several broken bones, and lungs scorched from inhaling toxic fumes, Niki Lauda was given his last rites by a priest, thinking that he would die shortly after. 6 weeks later, with blood still seeping from the bandages on his head, he finished 4th in the Italian Grand Prix. Doctors said he had recovered by sheer force of will and were astonished to see him competing so soon after his accident. The 1976 championship ended in a showdown between Niki and McLaren's James Hunt at Japan's Fuji circuit in torrential rain. Niki decided it was too dangerous to race and pulled out, handing the title to his friend and rival Hunt, who said Niki's withdrawal was an act of bravery.
What I found interesting about the movie / the actual reality of what happened.
It wasn't fiction, it is a real story.
Yes. Towards the end of the movies, when they show Niki Lauda pulling out of the race, and it was when it was raining really, really heavily, like the weather was just awful, and James Hunt was very much had his eye on a championship and he wanted to keep going. But I remember sitting and watching it and being like, why on earth would they even let this race continue?
Yeah.
Because it was really genuinely heavy rain to the point where it's completely dangerous. I don't think they would let it run currently in 2025. I think just watching that shows you how they really didn't care about the weather, like how the weather conditions can affect the drivers and how it can lead to crashes.
Yeah, I think once again, it was, Niki Lauda was just a force of nature, and how he was able to create and conjure up the amount of will and discipline to say, you know what, I'm going to jump right back in that car weeks later, I'll never know. Yeah. But I think in terms of the rain, obviously we have stoppages now, we'll have red flags, it will be delayed. We also have a window of time where you have to complete the race, otherwise, you'll have, the race will end, and so that we're not driving around in bad light and, dim light. So lots of positive changes have been made, but I'm glad that Niki Lauda's decision to pull out of that race was seen as an act of bravery, not an act of cowardice, because what he did in that fire must have been terrifying. And to recognise, actually, this isn't worth my life.
And he had a wife and kids to go home
exactly
to.
That. But I also think it starts to show slowly that, unfortunately, loads of lives had already been claimed to bad, lack of safety and also just bad crashes. And slowly in this time, you start to see people recognising this isn't worth it. It's not worth my life. It shouldn't be at the behest of my life. There's no need. So I think it was a really great thing that happened.
Now, in 1978, Professor Sid Watkins was asked by Bernie Ecclestone to join F1 and improve safety in the sport. Sid Watkins was not only one of the world's leading neurologists, he was a huge motor racing fan. His knowledge, leadership and determination began to turn the tide on safety.
Moving on to the 1980s, and it saw rapid advancements in car technology. Turbocharged engines dominated the decade, delivering immense power, but the increased speed brought more dangerous accidents. The FIA responded with new rules that limited engine power and enforced stricter safety regulations. In 1980, permanent medical centres had become mandatory, whilst rescue helicopters had to be on standby at all times in 1986, which was fun because when you and I went to go to Monza, there was a huge airfield that had loads of media helicopters, but multiple different medical helicopters that were just on standby, ready to go.
Okay.
And they weren't just sitting there empty. There was people in there waiting for a call if they needed to. They could airlift up and go straight over to the track, which was really cool. And I didn't know that they had those, to be honest with you. In 1981, the carbon fibre monocoque becomes standard and equipment is extended to the foot area. The ground effect era, which was first seen in F1 in the form of the Lotus 78 in 1977, was designed mainly by genius Colin Chapman, who was the first to take full advantage of the ground effect. This is the same concept of car that the current technical regulations follow in F1 today. But Reem, you already knew that, didn't you, from our regulations rundown hoedown?
Sure, yeah.
There to go. The car was successful and other teams began to develop and use cars with the same high aerodynamic grip. However, the cornering speeds were so high that the FIA eventually banned these from the 1983 season. It was banned because the 82 season had seen such a number of violent and fatal crashes. Refuelling began in Formula One properly in 1982 when Gordon Murray from the Brabham team discovered that the cars could perform quicker race times when starting with just a half tank of fuel. The FISA, now known as the FIA, please don't ask, then banned refuelling in 1984 on safety grounds. But just 10 years later, it returned following domination by the Williams team. During the first race with the new refuelling regulations in 1994, Michael Schumacher was able to gain an advantage over Ayrton Senna using refuelling to run the car lighter and faster after being unable to overtake the driver on track previously. Sorry, you frowned. Are you okay?
It's just the concept of refueling, the fact that that was allowed.
I know.
And then it was reintroduced is just hard to process because that doesn't seem safe. I mean, it's realistically, that seems stupid.
Like, it's true, yeah. I mean, we do it. They still do it to a degree in qualifying, for example. Like, you know, when they say that some cars will stay out on track for the length of one qualifying stint and they'll just keep doing laps after laps. So they'll be fueled for the session, whereas other drivers and teams decide, okay, we'll do 2 hot laps. Now we need to come in and refuel. But it's done a lot more controlled and a lot more safely than it was done back in those days.
Not when you're trying to do like a pit stop in the quickest amount of time.
Yeah.
You're like just speeding through things, not really considering the safety of it.
Yeah, and like doing that in a 2-hour race, imagine if a car stops working in the middle of that track and how many crashes that could lead to. Like, that just seems insane to me. Yeah. Sorry, that's why I was frowning. I was like, the fuck? Basically. That's what I was thinking.
From 1988, the entire monocoque is part of the crash test regulations. Over the following years, regulation is further tightened and extended to other components. This was introduced to ensure that only cars that could withstand severe impacts were allowed on the track. So a monocoque is the main part of the chassis in the car where the driver sits.
Okay.
So they're basically doing crash tests to make sure that if there was an impact, that the drivers wouldn't be crushed or hurt or killed from different areas and directions. They wouldn't get hurt, is the point. Okay. So they were only starting to do crash tests, which is very routine in Formula One today, back in the 80s and towards the end of the 80s.
Okay.
Oh, time for a wonderful decade, the 90s, when
the 90s.
Me, Iz and Reem were all born, which is what makes it so great. It wasn't that great for racing.
No, it wasn't.
So as Formula One entered the 1990s, it was riding a wave of major safety improvements made during the previous decade. Carbon fibre monocoques were first introduced in 1981 and had become the standard, which formed an incredibly strong survival cell around the driver. These structures drastically improved crash protection, turning what used to be fatal incidents into survivable ones. Field systems had evolved too. Flexible fuel bladders and better fireproofing reduced the risk of deadly fires. Drivers wore multi-layer fire-resistant suits and helmet design had improved significantly. The sport had also implemented crash testing medical cars, the official introduction of the safety car, and helicopter evacuation protocols. However, the 1994 San Marino Grand Prix marked not only one of Formula One's darkest weekends, but proved to be a turning point in car safety that would change the sport forever. The weekend started on a solemn note as Rubens Barrichello crashed heavily. The curbs launched Rubens into the tyre barrier at high speed. The young driver was knocked unconscious, but thankfully only had a broken nose and a bust lip. But the next day, during qualifying, tragedy struck. Roland Ratzenberger crashed at high speeds and suffered fatal injuries. Ayrton Senna commandeered a safety vehicle and headed straight to the scene to try and understand what had happened, and spoke to Professor Sid Watkins. Senna was clearly very emotional about seeing this. The next morning, Senna wasn't sure if he was going to race, and rival Alan Prost even remarked on how different Senna's mood was that day. Senna wanted to reform the GDPA and increase safety. Now, the GDPA was founded in 1961 and played an important role in the 1970s when Jackie Stewart and others were crusading for safety. Senna's Williams veered to the right of the left-hand Tamburello curve at 190 miles per hour, colliding with a concrete wall that lined the outside of the track. The force of the impact caused the front right wheel to come into the cockpit, and a piece of suspension fatally struck Senna's head. Professor Sid Watkins said, "We lifted him from the cockpit and laid him on the ground. As we did, he sighed. And although I'm not religious, I felt his spirit depart at that moment." Across 10 years in the sport, Senna claimed 65 pole positions, made 161 starts, scored more than 600 points, collected 80 podiums and 41 wins, and wound up with 3 world titles from 1988, 1990 and 1991. Ayrton Senna was one of the greatest Formula One drivers of all time, not just because he was incredibly fast, but because of the way he raced. He had a rare mix of talent, focus, and passion that made him stand out. He was known for being unbeatable in the rain, pushing cars to their limits, and delivering unforgettable performances, especially in qualifying laps. Off the tracks, he was deeply spiritual and cared a lot about his country, Brazil, and helping people in need. Senna's tragic death during the race in 1994 shocked the world and led to major safety changes in the sport. To many fans, he wasn't just a driver, he was a symbol of courage, perfectionism, and purpose. So how did it affect safety? Impact testing had been a feature of F1 since the 1980s, but the pace of development and improvement stepped up in 1994. All members of the refueling crew must now wear fireproof clothing. The FIA assigned a team of experts to check how Formula One racing can be made safer by means of new technologies. Auxiliary driving aids such as traction control, ABS, power-assisted brakes, and automatic transmissions were prohibited. The FIA uses computer analysis to identify 27 potentially dangerous corners that have to be made safer. Barrier technologies and runoff areas were re-evaluated starting in 1994 to include more effective energy-absorbing systems and sufficient space to decelerate vehicles before impact. Test procedures for tyre barriers became mandatory, and barriers must also be secured by rubber belts. The speed limit in the pit lane was reduced to 80 km per hour in practice and 120 km per hour in races. The production standard for helmets becomes stricter. In 1995, crash tests become stricter and lateral crash tests were introduced. 1997 FIA accident data recorders are installed in all cars for more precise accident analysis. A rear impact test and new rear crash structures are made mandatory. Tyre barriers have to be bolted down. And in 1999, wheel tethers are introduced to prevent wheels from flying off during accidents and endangering all of those on tracks. It was prompted by the 1990 Belgian Grand Prix, where a crash involving much of the grid resulted in several wheels becoming detached. The driver and seat can be removed together. Front crash tests become stricter. Asphalt instead of gravel is used for some runoff areas, and 4 medically equipped rescue vehicles and a car for the FIA doctor are made compulsory.
That is a whole lot of safety reforms.
All in one decade.
I think the Ayrton Senna's death was a huge signal to F1 and also motorsport. It was also televised, so that his crash happened live on telly. He came from Brazil. There was a lot of poverty, a lot of social unrest, and a lot of drivers were known to get out of Brazil, be able to make it in Formula One or other sports or other things, and they would kind of detach themselves away from Brazil. But what Senna did was he embraced where he was from, which was a huge thing for people over in Brazil. And he was very intent on helping people from his country. He had a lot of Brazilian pride. So his death and his passing was so tragic, and it also showed it exposed a lot of areas in safety that the sport still had a long way to keep going. And it was quite a big symbol in terms of the history of safety, of we cannot be complacent when it comes to this.
Was F1 not televised before the 90s?
It was televised, but not, I don't think it was televised in the very early days.
Okay.
So the point is that by the time we got to the 90s, it had become much more of a, Michael Schumacher was becoming a household name. Ayrton Senna was a household name.
Like there was more of an entertainment factor.
Yeah, there was a huge sort of new fan following.
And there was a lot of money in it as well, like cigarette sponsorships and stuff like that. Like it was just a money thing.
Okay.
But to watch a driver die live on television is a hugely traumatic thing. We're far away from the post-war sort of hardened look at death now. Coming into the 90s, people hadn't seen that happen. And also where he'd taken the head impact, his head sort of jolted and people believed he was still alive. They didn't believe he'd actually passed away. And he was so young that it was this huge star. And, you see Lewis Hamilton, for example, Ayrton Senna was one of his biggest inspirations in the sport. And he's now become an honorary citizen after his amazing performance in 2021 that he did in the Brazilian Grand Prix. And people like Felipe Massa as well, who was battling with Lewis for the 2008 championship. They haven't had a driver as big as Senna ever happen again in the sport. So losing him was a big tragedy.
I think as well, after the fact that he didn't want to be racing in that race.
Yeah.
The fact that someone had passed away the day before in qualifying, but the race was still able to go ahead because he didn't technically die at the track. He died at the hospital. Like, to get out of safety stuff on a technicality like that is just ridiculous.
God, yeah. It's just completely wrong. And I think
it shows where the priority was at.
Yeah, 100%. And I think all of those reforms, they should have been happening anyway.
Yeah.
It was just a shame and really, really sad that you had to lose one of the best drivers in history to be able to teach you we need to keep working. And I'm glad that Formula One did keep learning from it. And that is what we're seeing from this episode, that from the accidents and the tragedies that happened, although as sad as they were, it did push safety to be like, okay, this is actually something we really need to look at, because Sir Jackie Stewart was really villainised for looking and talking about safety. It was kind of, the whole attitude was kind of like, if you can't handle the heat, get out of the kitchen. But you come to the 90s and you have such a horrific crash like that, and just such a dark weekend for the sport. And the attitude started to change. Okay, this isn't good enough. We can't have this happen again.
It's like you said as well, it's money and attention that gets people to change the safety regulations and make sure that the rules are better. Because when there's no money in something, when you're just doing it as sort of like just a sport, like even when you think about the backgrounds of the drivers in the 1950s, where you were saying probably most of them were ex-military, ex-army, and that's why they were in the sport, because they had kind of not as much of a fear around death, so they were okay with it. And that was the background of the drivers when it first started, compared to the background of the drivers today, where most of them are coming from very rich backgrounds, very rich parents, and a lot of privilege. They're going to have a lot more safety rules around them, because rich people are protected. They're going to have safety rules. They're not going to risk their lives, unlike, when there's no money in something.
Yeah, I mean, I think as well, I think the sport has become a much bigger of an industry. It's become that being an F1 racing driver would be a full-time job, whereas it is evolved from the 50s where that wasn't the case. Yes, they do have a lot of money around them. It is a rich man's sport. There's no question around it. But I also think that you wouldn't have as many racers and aspiring racers in the sport today had there not been safety reforms. Because
Yeah.
who would want to be part of that? You know, it's entertainment, it's sport, there's fans around the world, but you don't want to watch something that can be fatal. That's
Yeah.
a very scary thing to watch. So it needed to be, with brands coming to it and having sponsorships, they don't want to see people being hurt. That's not good for their brand, and that's not fun for anyone to see. But Senna's death really was the catalyst for that, because he was just such a big household name at that time. By the time F1 entered the 2000s, it was no longer playing catch-up on safety. It had become the benchmark. The sport hadn't just reacted to tragedy, it rebuilt itself around the idea that speed and safety could and should coexist. In 2002, wheel tethers were introduced. On the first lap of the 2000 Monza Grand Prix, a major crash involving multiple cars sent debris flying off the track. A wheel from Heinz Harald Frenzen's car struck a marshal in the chest and killed him almost instantly. In 2001, during the Australian Grand Prix, Jacques Villeneuve collided with Ralf Schumacher. Villeneuve's car was launched into the air, hit the barrier, and a detached wheel flew through a gap in the catch fencing, striking a marshal and killing him. Before, in 1999, it was mandated that wheels were attached to the chassis by a tether to stop them from flying off during accidents. But as a result of these tragedies, the FIA mandated that each wheel now had to have 2 tethers. And in 2003, the HANDS device was introduced. The HANDS device stands for Head and Neck Support and consists of a carbon fibre shoulder collar which is secured under the driver's safety belts and connected to his helmet by 2 elastic straps. In the event of an accident, HANDS is intended to prevent stretching of the vertebrae and to prevent the driver's head from hitting the steering wheel. The HANDS device has had a significant impact on driver safety since its introduction. According to a study by Michigan State University's Biochemical Engineering Department, the HANDS device has reduced the risk of fatal or serious head and neck injuries by 88%.
Good for hands.
Damn.
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge amount. If you see, you know, when they take their helmets off after qualifying, and you see that they have to unclip something from their helmet, and that thing right behind there, that is the HANDS device. That's what it is. And it's meant to not only stop people from killing themselves when they're having, you know, their neck is moving far too much, but it's meant to stop themselves breaking their necks from that flexion, just keeping their head and neck all aligned. So it's really important. But when I was looking up into it, I wasn't actually completely sure where the HANDS device was, but it's that thing that clicks into them when they're in the car and when they're putting their helmet on.
Now, moving on to the more modern day Formula One, we're going from the 2010s until present day. Now, for the 2010 season, F1 once again banned refueling, and it remains outlawed today.
Good.
Yeah. Too right, F1. It had previously been banned between 1984 and 1994 on safety grounds, but come 2010, it was predominantly financial reasons that pushed the decision makers into moving away from refueling once again.
Financial reasons in what context?
If they didn't have to do refueling, then they wouldn't need to transport expensive specialised refueling rigs and equipment to every race. They would be able to lose a large amount of the need for specific personnel required for refueling, which brings down costs. And the ban kind of encouraged engine manufacturers to develop fuel-efficient engines so that they could just carry the amount of fuel needed for the whole race, as opposed to having to then bring all of that extra equipment to make sure that they can refuel.
Okay, that makes sense.
But there is plenty of evidence that without fueling, F1 is a safer place. Jos Verstappen, you know Jos?
Yes. Max Verstappen's dad?
Yes.
Correct.
Jos Verstappen's 1994 fiery incident at Hockenheim is the most well-known refueling accident during its brief reappearance, where an errant fire hose sprayed its contents on both the mechanics and the car, with Verstappen suffering mild burns in the dramatic blaze.
Have you seen the video of
I
that?
have, yeah.
You just sort of see a spattering of like fuel, and then he's in his car's stationary in the pits, and just seconds go by, and then suddenly whoosh, the whole thing goes up in flames.
Yeah.
God.
The whole thing. It looks terrifying. Really, really, really scary.
Both Felipe Massa and Heikki Kovalainen have dragged attached fuel hoses down the pit lane, with Kovalainen's hose going on to douse Kimi Räikkönen in fuel and engulfing him in flames in Brazil in 2009. These incidents highlight the risks that are now avoided by no longer having mechanics put fuel into cars under such intense pressure. Pit stops are also now quicker, simpler and faster.
I'm sure that the refueling probably added like a strategic element to races.
Yeah.
But it's not something I'm ever thinking like, oh, if only they had refueling added to F1. I don't think it's a necessary part of F1 for me.
Although I guess Ferrari nowadays would probably wish that they could still start a race on half a tank of fuel, because that's
true.
the only time that they're actually quick in a race
Ferrari
is the
would make
second half.
mistakes with refueling, and we all know it. So like, it's I don't know. It's a weird one.
And
because
we must protect Charles Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton.
We should. I mean, it's a weird
They
one.
have beautiful faces that cannot be impacted.
It's true. It's a weird one because I feel like people that have probably watched F1 during the years of there being refueling are probably like, oh, I think it would be really good. I'm sure that it wasn't just all, fires and unsafe things going on. I'm sure there was probably elements that really added to the racings, but when you haven't watched it live through seasons, you're kind of like, I don't think it's needed.
Yeah.
But it's just a strange thing that used to be a thing.
Now, in 2009, Felipe Massa was hit by a spring that came off another car during qualifying at the Hungarian Grand Prix. And as a result of this incident, in 2011, helmets had to have a nylon band attached above the visor that protects the drivers from flying parts. Formula One drivers began having accelerometers in their earpieces so that accurate data can be gathered on the forces acting on the driver, which is particularly important after a crash. Introduced in 2014, the ear was chosen as a non-invasive spot to put the instrument, and it also shows the exact movements of the head during an impact.
Because it's interesting, by sort of 90s, 2000s and so on, by this point it's then the FIA are finding ways to be able to record and understand a lot of these crashes and how the body reacts to it, how the car reacts to it, and testing things. Whereas in the first few decades of the sport, one, I'd argue the technology wasn't there for them to be able to do that, but two, the cars weren't built to be able to have features that could make sure that they were safe.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that by this point and earlier than that they were starting to have a genuine vested interest, and the attitude has completely switched to wanting to understand how does a crash happen and what things in every crash we've seen, what are the same things we keep seeing, so how can we improve safety, I think shows how much that the turning point changed there.
Moving on to Jules Bianchi. Jules Bianchi was a member of Ferrari's Young Driver Academy. He was a former Formula Renault and F3 Euro champion, and he tested with the Italian team as well as Force India and Mauritia. He was also a race winner in the GP2 series before progressing to the F1 grid in 2013. Bianchi sustained serious head injuries in the Suzuka accident, which occurred in heavy rain under yellow flag conditions. As marshals were working to recover the damaged Sauber of Adrian Sutil, who had crashed out a lap earlier, Bianchi lost control of his car, travelled across the runoff area and hit into the back of the recovery vehicle. Having sustained serious head and spine injuries, Jules died 9 months after the collision in a hospital in Nice, France.
I mean, this was a serious one. I remember watching Formula One when this happened, and it was incredibly tragic. He was very young when it happened, but it was also the first death that happened in Formula One since Ayrton Senna in 1994. So it was an added poignancy that it felt that the sport had advanced so much that death wasn't a normal occurrence like it was in the 50s to 70s, and it wasn't behind and lagging on safety like it was in the 90s. It felt that it had come up to par, and it was the sort of leading cutting edge in terms of technology and safety. And then we had this happen to a very young driver that was spoken about and promised that could have been the next big talent. But it was incredibly, incredibly unfortunate and very sad that he lost his life. But it was, I think the main thing was that he shouldn't have lost his life, but if he was going to have lost his life, at least make sure that in the future that can't happen again.
Yeah.
Because it was very shocking to see a Formula One driver die in 2014. It was very shocking. So,
which is why I still get very confused by why they do safety cars with recovery vehicles on track.
Yeah, it's a very good point, because they can still, even though they're going at slow speeds, they can still, when they're doing their tyre warm-up, anything can happen.
We've seen Grosjean crash under a safety car before while he's weaving and, just loses control of the car and crashes it into a barrier. Instead, there's nothing stopping it. So if you know that it's a risk, just red flag it.
Yeah, it's very true. I completely agree.
In 2015, the virtual safety car was introduced. This concept was introduced in the wake of Jules Bianchi's crash and was trialled during practice at the last 3 races of 2014. The VSC can be used to neutralise a race and will normally be used when double-waved yellow flags are needed on any section of the track and competitors or officials may be in danger, but the circumstances are not such to warrant the use of a safety car itself, as per the sporting regulations. Introduced in 2018, biometric gloves monitor the driver's conditions following a crash. Each glove is fitted with a 3mm thick sensor, which transmits data on the driver's pulse and blood oxygen levels back to their teams. The biometric data also gives the medical team information about the driver's condition if they need to quickly extract them from a car following an accident.
I think that's mad interesting. Because I did not know they had those in those gloves at all.
Well, it's kind of like, Apple Watches and Fitbits can like detect if you've had a fall.
Yeah, that's really true.
But also it makes sense, especially if there's a crash and there's a risk that the car is going to explode or like go up in flames or whatever. Like, that's good to know if they need to be getting the driver out ASAP, or if, worst case scenario, they've already passed in that car, then they're not going to be risking then also killing more people by going to save them.
Yeah.
Now, in 2018, we had the controversial introduction of the halo. Anyone want to go for a Beyonce line?
Halo.
Thank you. That was awful.
You just said the one, I thought you were going to sing a line from it. You just said the word halo.
I can see your halo. No, I'm not going to sing on this podcast.
Well, we're keeping it in,
No.
so you definitely are.
Now, a push for improved cockpit protection began in 2009 after two serious incidents. Henry Surtees was killed by a loose wheel in a Formula 2 race, and Felipe Massa suffered a head injury from a loose spring at the Hungarian Grand Prix. The issue resurfaced after Jules Bianchi's fatal crash with a recovery vehicle at the 2014 Japanese Grand Prix, and in 2015, Justin Wilson died after being struck by debris in an IndyCar race, prompting renewed calls from the GDPA for better head protection. The FIA had been researching cockpit safety for years and included a provision for the Halo device in the 2017 regulations, bringing track tests in 2016. However, concerns about limited real-world testing led to its introduction being delayed until 2018. In early 2017, attention shifted to a new device, the Shield, but its first test was cut short after Sebastian Vettel reported distorted vision. With little time left to finalise 2018 car designs and legal concerns mounting, the FIA confirmed Halo as the only viable option. The Halo was a simple design and is a titanium hoop positioned above the driver's helmet. The debate around Halo has centred around 5 points: safety, aesthetics, visibility, driver extraction, and, in a wider argument, the DNA of open-wheel racing itself. Lewis Hamilton memorably called the Halo device the worst-looking mod in Formula 1 history when it was first unveiled, and many agreed with him. Max Verstappen said, "There needs to be a certain element of risk. You can improve the car, but we don't need this thing on top of it. It's not just the looks. I don't think it's necessary." But it wouldn't be until Spa in 2018 before opinion would start to sway. Nico Hülkenberg missed his braking point at the first corner and rammed into the back of Fernando Alonso, sending Alonso's McLaren into the air. It landed on top of Charles Leclerc's Sauber, bouncing off the Halo. It could easily have been Leclerc's head instead. Afterwards, Alonso
Pretty head.
His pretty head indeed. What did I say? We need to protect it.
Rogue edition.
Afterwards, Alonso stated that it was clear proof that the device is a good thing for the sport, while Leclerc, who had initially been against it, had somehow been convinced it was good too. And then we also obviously had in 2021 Max Verstappen's car landing on top of Lewis Hamilton in Monza.
Yeah.
and, you know, there were tyre tracks left on Lewis's helmet. If that halo hadn't been there, he would have been crushed.
Yeah, I mean, he was, he could have had, I mean, it could have been fatal and he could have had serious head and neck injuries, but he left and just had to do a bit more extra physio on the plane back. And that was literally all that was the problem with him. When he was sort of talking in the press conferences, he was sort of putting his hand towards the top of his neck, but in nowhere close to anything that he would have sustained had there not have been the halo there. Because they're pretty sure the halo, it can take the weight of a double-decker London bus and it still would not break.
Oh, damn.
Yeah, it's designed to be very, very strong. And it has to be, because if you're going to have a car, you know, an F1 car all the way on top of you, you need to make sure that it can
Or even
sustain.
it flipping upside down at the crazy speeds that it does.
Exactly that. And in 2020, we saw Romain Grosjean's crash in Bahrain. On the first lap of the Bahrain Grand Prix, Romain Grosjean and his Haas went hurtling into the barriers at around 140 miles per hour. His car split, the barriers open, and ended up in two pieces, with the rear half remaining trackside. The front half, with Grosjean in it, pierced through the other side, and if it wasn't for the halo protecting him, it's near impossible that he would have survived it at all, let alone walk away from the incident with nothing but minor burns. It showed that safety had come a long way in F1, as Grosjean emerged from the flames after 28 seconds trapped inside his car. He only sustained burns on his hands. The images from after the crash showed that the titanium ring around his head absorbed a huge amount of the impact from the metal barriers. In a similar incident in 1974, it was Helmut Koenig's head that took the impact and he was decapitated.
Oh.
The same thing, or something similar, would have surely happened to Grosjean without the halo. Even with modern-day helmets, a head hitting a barrier at those speeds would have been fatal. Romain Grosjean himself praised the halo. "I wasn't for the halo so many years ago, but I think it's the greatest thing we've brought to Formula One, and without it, I wouldn't be able to speak to you today," he said from his hospital bed. Now let's have a look into the tech that saved Romain Grosjean's life. The survival cell. The survival cell is where the driver sits and is also known as the monocoque. This has become one of the most vital bits of safety equipment in Formula One today. It's been commonplace since the early 1980s, having first been pioneered by John Barnard's McLaren in 1981. Crash tests. Before the invention of the carbon fibre monocoque that is built like a cocoon, is designed to be unbreakable. Grosjean's crash was the best example of that, staying intact at nearly 67 G's impact, even though the Haas itself split in half. Grosjean had remained firmly within the safety cell and his body protected from all major injuries. The hands device essentially prevents rapid or uncontrolled movements of the head, preventing whiplash or worse. In a crash involving those kind of forces, the hands device can prevent broken necks and skull fractures. Driver extraction tests. Before the season, all drivers must be able to unbuckle, clear the cockpit, and get free from the car in 10 seconds. As Grosjean's car came to rest, he had a terrifying realisation. He was trapped inside the car by his left boot. Surrounded by flames and disorientated, his foot would not come loose until he forced it out of his boot. It took nearly 3 attempts before it was able to climb out of the car, and he endured 28 seconds and still made it out alive. Fireproof safety. The temperature of the kind of blaze that Grosjean sat in can range around anywhere from 800 degrees Celsius to 1000. The Haas driver was wearing an Alpine Stars suit made of Nomex, a flame-resistant material used in racing overalls for decades. And in 2021, the FIA pioneered new gloves, having identified that area as one of the few remaining weak spots that his crash had exposed. The governing body has continued making inroads in this area since. The medical car. At the start of each race, there's a road car deliberately following behind the back of the field, the F1 medical car. Driven by Alan Vandermeer, with Dr. Ian Roberts in the passenger seat, the car's job is simple: get to any first lap crash site as quickly as possible. And within 11 seconds, the medical car was parked by the accident, and around them, marshals doused the car with fire extinguishers. In 2021, gloves with increased fire protection were introduced in 2021 after Romain Grosjean's crash. The FIA began looking at ways to improve safety and began trialling gloves that would give more fire protection in similar incidents. Improved gloves were trialled at the 2021 Turkish Grand Prix, which allowed an extra 1.5 seconds of fire resistance.
Now, another major F1 racing accident has been Zhou Guanyu at the British Grand Prix in 2022. Zhou Guanyu, who was racing for Alfa Romeo at the time, which is obviously now Kick Sauber, had a very scary crash. and on the first lap of the race, his car was flipped over by contact from George Russell before hurtling upside down through the gravel and then launching over the tyre barriers. It was then trapped in a small gap in front of the catch fencing and spectators. After a nervous wait, Zhou was eventually recovered from the car and, incredibly, was cleared of any significant injuries. But being stuck between the tyre barrier and the catch fencing made it more complicated for emergency crews to extract Zhou from the wreckage, which would have been even more concern if the Chinese driver had been seriously injured in the accident or if the car had caught on fire. The other major concern was the absence of the roll hoop on the car after it was ripped off when he was skidding through the runoff area, meaning the only protection he had was the halo. In theory, the roll hoop is designed so that if the car is inverted, it can take the brunt of any impacts while leaving enough space to protect the driver's head. In 2023, the technical regulations stated that a round top is required on the roll hoop, which will reduce the chance of it digging into the ground during an accident, while they also ensure a minimum height for the point of application of the homologation test, which is essentially just safety testing.
So, to summarise, there have been key moments in F1 history that have served as reminders that motorsport cannot become complacent and that there's always more that can be improved upon when it comes to safety. And one thing that the sport has had to learn was that safety is everybody's responsibility, not just those in positions of authority. If F1 hadn't shifted their mentality over safety, it would have been overlooked and fatalities would have been continued to have been a normal occurrence throughout the sport.
That was very interesting. Obviously, more of a serious topic around safety, but I like what you said at the end about it not being just the responsibility of people in authority, because I think, yes, the FIA needs to be responsible. People who are creating the cars need to be responsible. But also instances like the Niki Lauda one that you mentioned, him pulling out of the race, I think that sets precedent for the rest of the drivers as well, to show that you could still be brave but also prioritize, your own life. Like Senna, for example, he tried to flag it. He didn't want to do that race, and I think that's what makes, the situation around his death, I think that's what makes it even more heartbreaking, is the fact that he didn't even want to do it, and he did, and then the worst happened, and no one wants to hear that the worst has happened. So it's very interesting to see how much it changed. What is a bit like grim is the fact that when you look at it from a wider perspective, I think it all has to do with money and entertainment. That's when people get serious about safety. When a sport or whatever, anything gets big and money starts being involved, and you can risk sponsors, risk brands working with you, you start to focus on safety. And it's heartbreaking that initially, when it didn't have that, they didn't care. I think that's my perspective on it.
It's a difficult one. I don't think that people didn't care about it. I just think that it was
a different time.
Yeah, it was a very, very different sort of landscape of opinion that you're dealing with, and a very different sort of caliber of driver that you were dealing with.
Yeah.
And I think that things like not having, a medical car and not having this, the fan standing so close to all of these tracks and not having proper barriers and all those sorts of things, they sound crazy by today's standards, but then you go back to where people were when they were doing those things and you kind of understand it to a degree. But I think the sad thing is that people like Sir Jackie Stewart spoke out very bravely and said, like, this isn't good enough. And people kind of villainized him for that. Yeah. And they didn't really want to hear it. And it was very much like, if you can't hack it, we'll find someone else that can. He kind of said that if he wasn't winning so much, that people wouldn't have listened to him. It was the fact that he was winning that he could get away with saying it, because if he wasn't winning, people would say, well, you're not very good at F1. You're just trying to say it needs to be more safe because you can't race. And that was the only reason that he was able to be listened to. But if you had a driver saying this isn't safe now, it would be looked into. It would be. It would be looked into. And you'd have organisations like the GDPA, which is obviously headed up by George Russell, that would be able to write up a statement and be able to bring that to teams and also to the FIA. There's just a lot more structure, and I think there's a lot more protocols in place, whereas when it started, there just wasn't. It just really wasn't like that at all. which is quite scary.
Yeah, 100%.
I think as well a major part of it is like the technological advancement as well.
God, yeah.
It seems like they were kind of waiting for, you know, road cars to advance before they were then being like, okay, what's the rest of the world doing that we can take inspiration from and bring into our sport and stuff like that? Or what are other sports doing? And then they started taking inspiration from aviation and space and stuff like that. So it was kind of where it started off as this small, more of like a hobby thing for some people. The innovation was slow, whereas now it is such a huge sport that the innovation is quick.
Yeah, 100%. That is like at the forefront of it, and actually a lot of stuff that they implement on F1 cars then transfers over to road cars.
Yeah.
But I think it was interesting because the late 1960s, early 1970s, they started adding front and rear wings onto cars in different ways because they realised, oh, the innovation that we have on aviation and planes, we can use on cars.
Yeah.
So even that was like a post-war kind of understanding that was what people knew about, and it only slowly transferred over to Formula One once they were like, oh, that actually makes sense, we can give that a whirl. And that was where we have the ground effect era cars that came in, that was all about, you know, creating downforce by sucking the cars to the floor and having aerodynamics. But the lack of understanding of it, and also the lack of understanding around crashes, I just don't think they really understood the connection between creating a car that has a certain amount of downforce but maybe not enough grip equals crashing. They just didn't seem to get it. Cut to 2022 when we had porpoising, for example, where the cars are going up and down, up and down. You know, the FIA said, okay, it's hurting people's backs, this needs to be eradicated out of the sport, we don't like that, let's lift the ride height for everybody. It wasn't just deal with it. You know, that's not the attitude. The FIA were very happy to look into stuff and, okay, there is actually a problem, let's change it. But back in those days, all they were looking at was how can we make the cars as fast as possible. When actually we've seen the FIA try to slow down the cars in recent years because they're getting too fast and they're worried it won't be safe enough. So I think looking at across all of those years, you can start to understand where the sport came from and what the ups and downs of what the problems they had to deal with over the years were. And even though it's quite a tragic past, I think it's quite important to learn about the past of a sport because it still has a lot of nods to when it started and where it started from. I think is really interesting to look at.
Yeah. You mentioned the last death happening in 2013 or 2014 and you were watching F1 at the time. What was that like, seeing that on screen? Because you were saying it wasn't so televised before.
It was very somber because I think it was a real reality check, because obviously before that it had been 1994 that anyone had seen a driver be seriously injured. But for Jules Bianchi, he then went into a coma. So it was a lot of people wishing Jules and his family well and hoping that he would be able to recover. But it was 9 months of waiting to hear what happened before.
Oh, really?
Yeah, before he eventually passed away. So it was a huge outcry about it. It's a reminder that F1 isn't safe, a call for more safety. The FIA did a huge analysis with Jules Bianchi's family, looking into the things they could improve and what things caused it and everything like that. They did a lot of analysis on that, the telemetry of his car, the sensors on his car, having a look at the driver onboard camera that he had, and all that sort of stuff. They did a very big investigation into all of it. But it felt surreal because you sometimes in modern F1 you forget that people can be seriously hurt or killed.
And in that 9 month period, was the race continuing?
Yeah.
And they didn't pause it, so they just kept going.
Yeah.
But I guess it was probably with a heavy heart.
Yeah,
then.
it was people. A lot of teams. I remember they put like a "Pray for Jules" on their cars or their race helmets as a reminder. And I think a lot of drivers found it a very sobering reality.
Yeah.
The same as they had it with Romain Grosjean's crash, because they red flagged the race and they went straight back into racing afterwards. And
I mean,
you
that
could
was
see them looking up
that
at
was
screens.
like a very hard watch, because they've got someone who's there selecting what cameras are going out on TV and stuff. And we didn't see the crash or anything live. What we were watching at the time was all the cars going around the corner, and then in the corner of the screen, just a puff of light from the fire. And then eventually it cuts to it, and they obviously red flagged the race. But for like an hour and a half afterwards, while it was red flagged and they were trying to clear the car away and repair the barriers and stuff before they then restarted the race, they just kept replaying the crash and kept playing the plume of smoke and fire and stuff on loop, and all of the drivers were up and down the pit lane looking at it but also not really wanting to look at it. And a few drivers also said afterwards they found it really hard, the fact that they kept showing it over and over and over again. Hard for them mentally, because they have to then get back into the car and accept that that is a risk that they're putting themselves into. But also hard for their families who are going to be at home watching it and thinking, oh my God, that could be my kid, that could be my husband, that could be my brother or whatnot.
Yeah. I can't imagine. Like, it is, like you said, a very sobering reality.
Yeah, but I think, well, if you see the driver messages that come up when we see a big crash in Formula One, and you see that thing is very quick to say, I'm okay, we all expect that. You naturally do expect that. And that's not ignorance. That's because the sport has done a really brilliant job at making things a lot more safe. You do expect nearly all of the accidents you see to come out of that car and be perfectly fine. But when we had, Jules Bianchi pass, or you have Ayrton Senna, it's a huge thing of like, oh my God, that person's not going to be back in the sport. They're not getting out of the car and walking away. You see Jack Doohan's crash this year was a huge crash, and he was absolutely fine. Same with Yuki Tsunoda. You have these big crashes, and they don't have that happen. You don't expect it.
Even like last week, we were joking about the whole Max and Russell incident and how he was retaliating, and it was kind of like nothing happened to them, so it was a funny thing to talk about. And we were talking about how how stupid he was for doing that because it got him a penalty. But imagine how different that conversation would have been if he purposely crashed into Russell and that ended up being like an actual big crash for the both of them, because it's like there's a very fine line between it being just an instant to like, this is very, very serious.
Yeah, and I think that's down to the technologies and the devices, and I think as well the understanding that Formula One has gained on crashes and incidents, and I think that they've got a huge amount of resources nowadays to be able to veer away from big crashes turning into fatalities. But it is still there. It is still a huge risk. These drivers drive incredibly quickly, and there is still a massive risk involved. Motorsport will never not be dangerous. We just don't want it to be fatal. And that's always the case.
To your point about Max, that's why there needs to be like a heavier punishment for deliberately causing an accident like that, deliberately driving into someone. You just never know. Like, you think like, oh yeah, it was just a little tap. Yeah, but it could have had a further ramification that you couldn't have even predicted. Sort of like $1 Million Baby with the last fight where her opponent punches her. And she gets paralyzed because her corner brought out the chair, and that's what she knocks her neck into. Obviously, the opponent didn't know that she was going to hit her neck on the chair, the same way that a driver doing something like that might not know that where they're hitting it, that part of the car is a bit weak, and actually it's going to expose this, and it's going to make the car catch on fire. Or, the tires are actually 70 laps old, and they have no grip on them, so by doing that, you're going to send them off into a spin and stuff like that. Like, you just don't know, so why risk it?
100%.
Yeah,
because then you have to deal with the consequence of that being on your conscience if it does go wrong.
It's very true. But I think that's they have a large amount of analysis that goes on in the stewards room, trying to make sure that it's a fair enough penalty for the safety involved of it. I think a lot of the time, we've talked about it before, with the wet race, they have wet tyres, but they never send them out. But then you hear things like, in Japan, 76 with Niki Lauda, and you say like, well, they shouldn't have been racing. It's that weird line when you get used to people not getting injured in incidents, you get used to
then
not.
You expect a bit more.
Yeah, you kind of say like, well, come on, no one ever gets hurt in this sport, it's fine. But then you have a long history of all those officials. Lots of them would have worked in the sport for many decades. They would have seen a lot of awful things, and they'll say, I'm not putting my name to that, no way. I think we're lucky in this day and age of Formula One. We're living a great time of Formula One. You go in, you watch a race live, you don't expect anyone to get hurt, but that history that we've just gone through is the reason why we don't have as many fatalities as we used to. It's because they've implemented so many things to make sure that is not the case, which is a brilliant thing. It's just a shame that we've had to have so many people lose their lives to get to this point now. It's taken 75 years, which is a long time.
Well, there you have it. That is safety in F1 over a 75-year period.
A brief overlook.
Overlook?
A brief overlook. No, I said it again. A brief overlook. No.
Overview.
A brief overview. My bad.
And next week we will be back to racing. Meow.
Canada about mooses, eh?
It's the Canadian Grand Prix, in case you couldn't tell. Maple syrup.
Toronto,
Poutine.
right? Am I right?
What
That's a
did you say?
poutine.
Oh, poutine.
Oh,
Oh, I
sorry.
I miss poutine. So make sure you give us a follow and a subscribe so that you do not miss our Canadian Grand Prix episode. Check out our social media. We are available on Instagram, X, TikTok, and YouTube.
Let us know if you liked this episode. It was a hell of a lot of work, and boy golly was it quite a big amount of information, so let us know.
And yes, it was a tone change from our normal episodes, but I'm sure after hearing some of the stuff that you did in the episode, you can understand why.
Yeah.
Hopefully we will be back to our normal buoyant selves in next week's Canadian Grand Prix episode. Anything you'd like to add, Reem?
Did you enjoy
see
this?
ya.
Oh.
Oh.
I was about to ask you a question.
Oh,
Did you enjoy this episode? Did you find it insightful?
I did. I do. I kind of want to I want to go on a deep hole into Wikipedia and read a bit more about it, just because it is very interesting.
Damn.
Yeah. First time I've
converted
done
her.
that.
She's
They
converted
do that
her.
for
No,
regulations.
first she knows her flags
Yeah.
and now she wants to do a deep dive of research into safety?
Yeah,
What
we've watched
is
some
she?
movies.
Damn.
Yeah.
Oh, we've got some movies on. Moving fatalities.
some F1 movies.
Okay,
like the
fine.
louder one.